Welcome back to another episode of Timebreaker Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel.
And I'm Anthony.
And welcome back. We did take a little bit of a unannounced hiatus. Apologies for that. But, we figured with the holidays, Thanksgiving coming up, and we've been going nonstop for quite a while through thick and thin. So we just need a little break. Hope you guys understand. But we're back again. It's basically, we've been toying around with the term Spider Month because we got the Sam Raimi trilogy coming up. Next week we're talking about the Andrew Garfield films. And then we're talking about Tom Holland movies. And then we got No Way Home. And, so it's a lot of Spider-Man coming up. So if you guys are excited for that, make sure you subscribe. But jumping into the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. Man, I love this thing. How did you get involved with the Spider-Man Raimi trilogy?
I think I was just introduced to it when I was little, and I think I saw bits and pieces. I know that eventually I'd been given the DVD copies, but I think most of all the first two, it was at home, whatever I caught it. I think I have more memories of the first one than the second one because I think it was just put on more in my household. And then the first one I saw in theaters though was Spider-Man 3.
Okay, so this one, similarly, like any kid growing up around the same time as us was probably raised on this trilogy. Spider-Man 1 and 2 were already out, so I'm pretty sure my dad had DVDs, and I was seeing these by the time I was 4 or 5 years old. They were big movies in my house. We were just watching them, and Tobey was my Spider-Man growing up, so it means a lot to me. And I think I have that nostalgia attachment just to the entire trilogy. So I probably like Spider-Man 3 more than the average Joe. But, we're going to be here talking about it, breaking it down, starting with Spider-Man 1, which is, essentially the birth of the modern comic book movies, right? We didn't have anything. There's no playbook. We had X-Men, but I feel like Spider-Man 1 was really the beginning of this movement. What did you think?
Yeah, I think that X-Men, it's one of the first examples of a big superhero movie. I mean, it's not to say there weren't superhero movies before these two, but I think Spider-Man was what kind of defined a genre, and I think it was the first big example of a worldwide presence of just making lots of money, having an audience worldwide, and I think this is the first example of it.
Yeah, and X-Men is good, it's great, it's awesome, it does what it needed to, but it doesn't feel like a super comic book movie. This trilogy feels like a comic book movie. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, I understand that. I haven't seen X-Men in such a long time, so I can't really compare the two.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know, X-Men's just a little more grounded, but this one's fun, it's light, and it just totally fits the era that it was made, we have these characters and these actors that are way older than their parts, but that was kind of a normal thing. And it's cheesy, it's fun, but it's a good time watching this movie. I don't know how to explain it. It's not 100% well crafted, so to speak, but it's just awesome and fun.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a very fun movie. It's a great introduction to the character, especially if you've never especially without knowing who the character is. I think it does a really good job of delving into each of these characters and giving them an arc and all that stuff. And I think that the villain, good enough. Especially as a first example, I think he does a good job. I think when you look at other villains throughout the trilogy, I don't know, he kind of gets sidelined a little bit, but I think that's just the issue with origin movies is that your villain kind of does get a little bit sidelined.
Right, and this very much is the origin story of Peter Parker. And, me growing up, this was the first time I ever saw it. So this was the first time I watched it. And as I've watched the other iterations of Spider-Man on screen, I have to say this is the best one. And it's probably one of the better origin stories out there, with all the stuff with Uncle Ben and what Peter's going through. It's really, really good and really builds up the story in a good way that introduces new people to the character.
Yeah, and it wasn't for a very long time after this where we saw another origin movie. I mean, really, your first example of seeing another superhero origin movie would be Batman in 2005, Batman Begins, and then you got Iron Man in 2008, and those are your two prime examples, also leading into our modern superhero movies we have today.
Right, and I'd argue all the Spider-Man and then Batman Begins and Iron Man, they're all perfect origin stories for their respective characters.
Yeah.
And then So leading things off with Toby Maguire, he's headed this franchise, basically. He is Spider-Man to the world now. And I think he knocks it out of the park. Some people have some gripes with him. They think he's a I think it's universal that Toby plays a great Peter Parker. Most people, I'd say, when their criticism come with it's his portrayal of Spider-Man. Like, what is your take on it?
Yeah, he really does, like, when you look at him, he really does give you, like, he is Peter Parker. And yeah, I think a lot of it if there were criticism, like for me, I really don't have many, but if there were criticisms, yeah, it would probably be in the actual portrayal of Spider-Man. And I think that, especially as you move on, I think sometimes you get it, the opposite way, where I think that Andrew Garfield, ends up having a really good Spider-Man, but a lot of people didn't like him as Peter Parker. And I think it's just very mixed. I think it's just a, preference for people and how they see Spider-Man and how they're going to take each actor.
Oh, right. And, for me too, I don't have that many criticism of him. I love him both as Peter Parker and Spider-Man. And I think he's the way Tobey Maguire portrays it, it's just, he's such a relatable guy. He's that high school nerd, and, we're all that guy. And we see him go through, we see him become somebody important, we see him get all this responsibility, we see him get the girl, and it like kind of inspires like the nerd culture, if you will. Like, yo, we can be more than just the nerd. We can get the girl. We can do all this stuff. And then even him as Spider-Man, he's still quippy, he's still fun, and he's still heroic. And so I think he knocks it out of the park in both aspects, personally.
Yeah, and I think just a lot of things go in favor of this movie. I mean, I think if you took certain elements out, this movie wouldn't have worked. I think the score is iconic, and it really like defines this trilogy. And I think if you didn't have that soundtrack with this movie, I don't know. I think the impact of this movie would be felt less.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Danny Elfman that did the score. And man, I swear, if I hear that theme, that we get at the beginning of every Tobey film with the credits, if I get that for the Marvel intro and Far From Home, or No Way Home, I'm gonna lose my crap.
I don't know.
Like, I think you're right now.
I think you're.
I don't think it's gonna happen, but I'm just saying. I've seen people edit together, and it gives me chills. That's all I'm gonna say. But yeah, Tobey Maguire isn't the only one that is great in these films. I mean, these films in particular are filled with an ensemble of characters, and they're not all super important. Some of them are very minor roles, but I think every character in this universe that Sam Raimi has created has like a character to fill, and each of them adds something to the overall world of New York that Spider-Man's in.
Yeah, I think that especially in the first two movies, you have a lot of side characters, but they're also not particularly treated as side characters. Like, anyone who has anything really major to do with the plot, even in like a minor way, but like has a minor major presence in the plot, like they're definitely like fleshed out. I think as you move on with the trilogy, like 2, they get a little more defined, but then 3 is where you got some issues with like side characters. But in the first one, that's not present.
Right. We got Uncle Ben, and while I rewatched it, Uncle Ben's like in 3 scenes in the movie, but it just, his impact is there. And then we get him in flashbacks throughout the rest of the trilogy. But, this was the most impact that Uncle Ben scene had. I totally didn't really feel that in the Andrew Garfield stuff, but this one hit in this trilogy for me.
I think it was just the way it's portrayed. And again, I kind of hate that people compare Amazing Spider-Man, Tom Holland Spider-Man, because I honestly love the fact that each of these Spider-Mans has had their own, unique way of how their origins plays out and who they are as a character. They're all different. Like, they have the same morals, but they're different takes on the same character.
Yeah, for sure. And then, it's not just Uncle Ben. We got Aunt May. Rosemary Harris is awesome in this trilogy. I think she just brings such a nurturing aspect to the character that Peter desperately needs, and is just always there for him. And it's always great watching her scenes.
Yeah, and I would say she's probably the Aunt May that gives off the most like mothery vibe of the 3 that we've seen.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, Marissa Tomei, I mean, she's like barely in the movie, so it's like hard, right?
Right.
Yeah. And then I guess it's just nostalgia. A lot of this is just nostalgia. That's why I like Rosemary Harris the most. But And then we got even more characters. We got MJ, and she's a huge part of these movies, and um, definitely like depending on which film you're talking about, MJ has like kind of a sideline role. But I feel like in the first two, and then especially the second one, the writing for her is like really great.
Yeah, I would agree. The first and the second one, like the people who wrote the script did a really good job with it. But like, man, like she probably has the most. She's probably on my top 3 things I don't like about Spider-Man 3, and it all
Yeah,
is. I don't. And it has nothing to do with her. It has to do with how they wrote her character, and I don't
yeah.
like how she was used in Spider-Man 3.
Right. And yeah, and I heard that even like I mean she is a damsel in distress. I mean the character is basically that's their job in the entire trilogy. And I heard that even like for Spider-Man 3 she was like so done with it that she wouldn't physically scream, so they just dubbed in previous screams, which that's yikes.
Right? That's like, all right, we have one job for you. I don't want to do it. Well, can you act like you're doing it?
Yeah, but I mean I don't blame her cuz I mean that's like all she does in this trilogy.
Yeah, her most major role is probably in the first one, and she's kind of has a like smaller role in the second one, and then she has like a bigger role in the third one. But because of like how she's used, it's kind of just I don't know. It's almost annoyance in how she's used.
Yeah, it's like she's just getting tossed around as like an object, which is not great.
Yeah.
But then we got the Osbornes, James Franco. We're not going to talk about James Franco. We're talking about James Franco's performance as Harry Osborne. Okay. I thought he's a great Harry. He's got a lot of depth, and the way they built his character up through the trilogy, I really like to see that growth. And then Norman, I think he plays an awesome dual role with Norman Osborn versus Green Goblin. So I think that was really cool, and that necessary family dynamic, where he's that father figure kind of to Peter is just really important for this movie in particular.
Yeah, I really like the fact that Norman Osborn is this father figure because you don't get to see this again in any other Spider-Man movie. Like this is the only one so far that's had that relationship, and it's kind of interesting to see because Peter doesn't have a father figure, and like he kind of sees it in Uncle Ben, but you know, it's also kind of different because I feel like Norman's closer to a dad, where I think that he definitely sees Uncle Ben as like a grandparent, and I think that so Norman Osborn then is like a father figure for him. And again with Harry, like I personally really like his arc throughout the 3 movies. I mean, I think his plot kind of got thrown around in Spider-Man 3, but again, just that movie as a whole, we're gonna talk about it later, but like there's issues with that movie
Right.
rewatching it.
And to go with that whole father figure thing, like it's a theme that's played around, but I think it totally gets cemented. And it's great writing when at the final fight, Peter's like, "I had a father. His name was Ben Parker," and then that's when Green Goblin dies. So I think that full circle really is important to that film and that the themes that are going on in that movie.
Yeah, I think leading up to that moment, he was definitely seeing Norman Osborn as more of a father figure than Uncle Ben because he was kind of like sidelining Uncle Ben, wasn't letting him in, kind of pushing him away. And then, like you said, it comes full circle, and now he understands what Uncle Ben was trying to do for him, and so, he grows as a character.
Right, and for being in 2002, right? This movie's got pretty groundbreaking VFX and CGI, and especially with like the Spider-Man stuff and the Green Goblin stuff, it's at the time it's mind-blowing to watch. And I mean, it's not perfect now, but it still like holds up pretty well, I'd have to say.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have some very different views on how the image is going to look because I have actually seen the 4K releases of these, and I know that you've only seen the Blu-ray ones. The 4K image is really nice because they went and redid a full scan of the movie, and it looks really good. Like,
Oh, okay.
okay, not crystal clear because, because they kept the, what's the word I'm looking for? They kept the film grain in. And so you're not getting a crystal clear image. The only way to get a crystal clear image is to shoot something completely digital and high resolution.
Right. But I mean, at the time, like all these movies were being shot on film, and digital wasn't 100% there, I'd
I
say.
think going back to the original like film and rescanning it allows the film to look better, because I think if you take the digital and then upscale it, I think it makes VFX work from the early 2000s look really meh if it's not done correctly. And I think just
Yeah,
having resourced it allowed it to look better, because the VFX
right.
didn't like look off to me on the 4K disc.
But I mean, in terms of just like how everything is shot and the action, it was so refreshing, and it's still, I think it's, especially in this trilogy, it's the best looking Spider-Man. You know, just watching how they approach the Spider-Man action, how they approach the web swinging. It's something you just don't get, and like the way the camera moves, and it's so refreshing. And I totally would love them to start doing that in like the Tom Holland films.
Yeah, and it's not even something that's unique to Toby Maguire's Spider-Man, because I think Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man got more web time, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know, but in
Yeah,
like the MCU, Spider-Man, I don't know,
he
he's
don't be
more like
web
on the
swinging, man.
ground a lot, and if he does like move around with his webs, I feel like the camera's like the way it's captured doesn't give that full impact. I feel like shots are too close, and if he is using his
Right.
webs, he's like moving out of the way of something. Where in the Raimi trilogy, things are like you actually see him moving around, swinging, and I don't know. It's kind of unique to this trilogy. And Andrew Garfield's, while it had those, it had less of it, because I think as we moved more towards a VFX Spider-Man, that's just what we got.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that's probably like one of the signature themes of this trilogy is how well that they shoot that and capture it, and I think it's still just a staple of this film and this trilogy as a whole.
Yeah.
So then moving into Spider-Man 2, which is, to me personally, it's one of the best. It's in my top 5 comic book movies of all time. Like, it is so good. When we talk about great sequels on this show, as we do a lot, this is what we're talking about, man.
Yeah, so it took me so long to like actually sit down and rewatch this movie, and when you do, oh my gosh, it's like it is a blend of like three different movies in one, and somehow it works.
It's just
Like
so good.
there is action sequences, there's a lot of drama in this movie, and my goodness, there are some like horror vibes given off
Yeah.
by Doc Ock. Like, and it perfectly is able to blend these scenes together to work. And it's surprising because a lot of movies can't deal with overarching tones, and this movie is able to make an exception of it.
Right, and I think that's attributed to Sam Raimi's background in horror. You know, I think the sequence everybody thinks about is when Doc Ock is taken out and they're gonna go cut the limbs off, and then the arms come alive. It's so scary, and just the way it's shot, it's just, yeah, like you said, it's very horror influenced.
I think it has a bigger impact because it's not like directly shown, it's shown as an outside, like you're seeing shadows on the wall and them getting killed, but you're not directly seeing an impact. And I think that it
Right.
makes a bigger visual impact on you, because now you're using your imagination as to what is going on. And I've heard this from a couple of different directors before, and how sometimes it's best to not show something. I know that the Venom directors, the two of them, have both said that they use this trick in order to keep the PG-13 rating. And I feel like this is a better execution of it, because I feel like these movies didn't need to be rated R, and so I think that this
Oh
works
no.
because you get to convey something very dark while also not jumping to the next rating. Where I feel like Venom, it's the opposite, where I feel the character should have been rated R, and so to go this cheap route around it almost feels like an X-Men Apocalypse approach.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is the classic approach to what we don't see is scarier than what we do see, and what every horror indie filmmaker needs to learn is what you don't show is more scary than whatever you're going to show. You know, you look at the Jaws opening, or you look at Jaws in general. We don't see the shark, but it's scary because we don't see the shark. We don't know where it's coming from. You talk about Alien, you know, you don't know where the alien's coming from because it's in the dark. It's so much scarier when you build that suspense, and whatever we can create in our minds is going to be scarier than what you're going to show us on screen. I'd say like 9 times out of 10. And using that approach in certain scenes really helps, blend those genres or sprinkle in kind of elements of horror into this movie. So like we said, this movie really builds upon the themes of the first one. And I think it encapsulates the idea of Spider-Man so well. And you see that they're kind of talking about the themes in No Way Home about like with this movie, but it's all about what Peter wants. The choices, like, is he allowed to have what he wants, or does he have to have the responsibility of being Spider-Man and give up those things? It's the time-old question of Peter Parker, and it's executed brilliantly in this film.
Yeah, I would also agree, and it also, does the classic sequel not having to build Peter Parker back up as a character. We know who he is, and actually, in this one, you actually develop him a lot. Like between the first and the second one, there's actually is some development because now you're moving from him being a high school student, you're really starting to see him be an adult, and I think that's the key to the opening to this movie, is showing that his Spider-Man life and his adult life are struggling to come together and work. And I think it's just a grounded approach to showing how, yeah, being a superhero is fun, but also you have to be able to tackle everything else that comes with it. And I think that the Spider-Man movies that deal with this, and it's not just movies, games and stuff that go this approach, I think they're more relatable, and it brings Spider-Man down to a grounded level. Because I know that the Spider-Man game from 2018 also did this, where he's trying to balance his life between work and making money and paying his bills, but also being Spider-Man.
Right, and I think that's one of the biggest stark contrasts between Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3. Spider-Man 3 starts off, everything's perfect for Peter. He's Spider-Man, everybody loves him, he's successful and everything. But it only works because he went through the struggle of Spider-Man 2. Because Spider-Man 2, he can't pay rent, he's struggling telling everybody who he is. He wants MJ, but she can't know, so she's going to be far away. She's with other guys. Harry knows that Spider-Man killed his dad, so he hates Peter, and Aunt May's getting evicted from her house, and there's just so many things that aren't going well for Spider-Man in this movie, and you get to see him even with his powers. He's struggling with his powers. That was something that I totally didn't expect, that you don't really see a lot in superhero movies, and the way it's tackled in this film is just such a great way of showing the conflict that Tobey or Peter has to go through.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the two superhero movies I can think of off the top of my head that have the same approach of, okay, let's take our hero and let's take away their abilities and how they respond to this, it's kind of like Iron Man 3, but Iron Man 3 takes a very, different approach than this movie does into how it, deals with that. Right. But yeah, I mean, it's a very unexpected turn. Even for a sequel, it's an unexpected turn because all you've really known his character as is that Spider-Man as of, 20, 30 minutes into the first one. So to now have him powerless, and I think it's for roughly 30 minutes of the runtime of Spider-Man 2.
It's a while, yeah.
It's a decent chunk, yeah. And to see our character vulnerable like this, I mean, you have scenes where, as Spider-Man, this was no big deal, but going in without his powers, it's dangerous. The fire, which is very, reminiscent of the first one, having that fire scene, and you get to see that stark contrast and how he has to handle it differently because he doesn't have his powers. And I think it's just things like this that just add to a greater layer of detail and examining a character.
Right, and I mean, you talk about that fire scene. I love that scene because, yeah, it harkens back to the first one where he goes in as Spider-Man, saves people. Yeah, he saves somebody, and then he goes back and then Goblin ambushes him. But then in this one, another fire, but he doesn't have his powers, but he still goes in because that's who Peter Parker is. And, he saves the little girl, but then we hear that somebody else died, and then he feels guilty. Like, if he was Spider-Man, he could have done more and maybe saved it, and that's, I think, one of the shifts that makes him go back to being Spider-Man. But yeah, it increases the tension with all the characters. His relationships with Mary Jane and with Harry, they all evolve because there's that tension there with him and his father, and even the introduction of Alfred Molina as Doc Ock, I think is another great villain in this trilogy because he has a personal relationship with Peter. He's working on the paper. He gets to meet him. We have that amazing scene where they get to know each other. And so it is a very personal relationship with this villain, and I think that's one of the strengths of this trilogy is that all the villains have a personal relationship with Peter Parker versus, some of the other stuff in the MCU or other superhero movies, they're just kind of like a villain that comes out of nowhere. They all have something to do with Peter Parker, and it makes the fight with the villain a little bit more intense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I also just think that the Doc Ock that we see in this movie is, you get to see his internal struggle and how, the chip is changing his personality and how he responds to people and how he as an individual changes. And, it also gives us some of the greatest action sequences we've probably seen this whole trilogy. The train sequence is outstanding, and the train sequence isn't just there as a fun scene. Like, it's there to show the internal struggle of our hero and how the villain is making our hero choose between getting him and saving all these people and having to make that choice. And there's just some really deep themes in this movie, and I think it's why it resonates so well with people.
Right, and then speaking of that train sequence, it does one of the amazing things that Spider-Man movies don't do, is it shows, he gets the mask taken off and all the people see who he is, but there's like that mutual respect where they understand Spider-Man and what he has to do, and so they honor him enough to not tell anybody. And you can really see, and I feel like especially in this trilogy, the city of New York is almost a character in and of himself, where they're willing to lay down their lives. They're helping him out against Goblin. They're helping him out against Doc Ock. And, it's just something just to gives it a little bit more life to see the city and the people come to life.
Yeah, and you kind of lose this in the third movie, and then you see it briefly in Amazing Spider-Man 1, and that's really it. You never see, like, the citizens of New York ever interacting with Spider-Man really again after this point.
Yeah. And then, kind of a off track, but we got to talk about the Daily Bugle.
Oh my gosh, I love the Daily Bugle in all three movies. Best part about all three movies.
Perfect
Hands
casting.
Down. Absolutely.
J.K. Simmons is J. Jonah Jameson. I could just watch that dude on loop. It is so entertaining. So glad that they brought him back for these Tom Holland films, but it just doesn't compare to the Raimi trilogy.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the way the character's written. It's his performance. He is so believable as this character. And like, if you see him in anything else, you're just like, that's J. Jonah Jameson. Like,
yeah, like it's so perfect. It's one of the saving graces of Spider-Man 3 because this is still a part of Spider-Man 3 and it's still great. So I just wanted to shout out J. Jonah Jameson and just how awesome everything, and even just there's other characters in there too that are just so memorable and just add so much more to those scenes.
Yeah, and going into like the very ending of this movie, seeing Doc Ock switch from the villain back to the hero and getting to save everyone, sacrificing himself to do it, it's not something you see a lot in movies where the villain is able to see their mistakes before it's too late.
Right, it's like, that's what I love too about Doc Ock is because he's a human before he's a villain. We see that good side of him at the beginning, and then we see him get corrupted by the arms, and then we see him fight back and take back control. And he was the hero at the end. I will not die a monster, as he said. And so I hope they kind of keep that spirit in line with No Way Home, but I also wouldn't be surprised if they just keep him a villain, and I'll be kind of disappointed because that's not who he is. But I'm still glad that we have this portrayal of him in Spider-Man 2, as I think it's perfect and just the way he contributes to the film. And then, MJ finally figures out that it's Peter, and, all the stars align and it makes sense. And after everything he's gone through in Spider-Man 2, we get the good ending.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, I think the endings for this movie also made Spider-Man 3 very hard to do anyway.
Right.
Like,
aside from one thing.
It's kind of like a Last Jedi situation where you wrapped all the bows up and
Minus
there
one.
Weren't right, but there weren't many other plot like threads to go off of. I mean, and what they did explore in Spider-Man 3, I don't know. I think they could have executed it better.
100%. So the one thing that is left open is that Harry knows who Peter is. He knows Peter Spider-Man, and then he inherits all the Green Goblin tech. So that's obviously where they were leading into with Spider-Man 3. And then Spider-Man 3 starts off awesome. You know, Peter's having a great life. He's awesome as Spider-Man. He's succeeding in all his classes. Mary Jane's on Broadway. Everything's great, but then we pan up and we see Harry up above watching the show, and we know that he knows. And then up until that whole part, and then, you know, he's going to propose Mary Jane. It's great. And then he gets attacked in the alleyway by New Goblin. I think all that stuff is amazing, and it's perfect, and it's totally falls in line with where the trilogy was going. And, you know, there's a lot of strengths to Spider-Man 3. There's also a lot of faults. I think the Harry stuff, had it been executed a little better, I think the trajectory of the Harry stuff was one of the strengths of this movie, and I think was where they should have doubled down on their focus.
I think where the Harry storyline was going worked, but
right.
I think the whole amnesia thing just kind of ruined it.
Yeah, as soon as he gets knocked out, it kind of dies.
And, you know, I'm actually kind of glad that, you know what, if you're going to go that route with your story, I'm kind of glad that they didn't just try and double down on it and be like, all right. I mean, he does come back, like, towards the end of the movie, but I feel like it's such a minor part of the movie that I can really overlook the fact that they kind of made James Franco a little punk for the next of the movie, for the rest of the movie. Things I do like about this movie is Sandman. And I think he's very underappreciated, is that his storyline in this movie is fantastic.
Yeah.
And hands down, I wish they had, like, if we're going to talk about doubling down, I wish they had doubled down on Sandman, removed Venom completely, and removed the symbiote, like, entirely, and they just doubled down on Sandman, because he had such a great plot going through this movie. He had a great character arc, and I feel like it's sidelined because of all the other things this movie tried to do.
Yeah, I think if I was, I think we're all in the camp of what Sam Raimi wanted. You know, there was that whole thing between Sam Raimi and what Sony wanted. Sony wanted Venom because Venom's Venom. But I think what this movie really needed to do is take that momentum from Spider-Man 2 with Harry knowing who Peter was. You get the New Goblin, and then you also get this stuff with Sandman, because he murdered. He actually was the one that killed Uncle Ben. I think that's moves flawless or seamlessly into Peter's storyline, and then you get both a personal connection with Harry and Sandman, because they both have that tie to Peter, and you kind of do that route, and then leave Venom and the symbiote and all bully Maguire for Spider-Man 4. I think that would have made. I don't know, man.
I don't think I would have wanted. I don't. Like, the worst parts of Spider-Man 3, you could not have doubled down on and made a good movie out of it.
No, I know, but I'm just saying, for Spider-Man 3, if they just went with Harry and Sandman, I think it would have been arguably a perfect trilogy.
Yeah, and, you know, looking at all the interviews, it's really a situation of, we're the studio, we're paying for this, and you're going to do what we want, and it's really sad because Raimi did not want Venom in this movie. He told them constantly that he had no intention, and when they said no, we want it in there, he kind of said, fine, I'll give you Venom, and kind of like spit in their face in how he was going to do it, because he didn't want Venom in this movie.
Right.
And I think watching it, it really, really shows that he had no interest in having Venom in this movie, and he shoehorned him in. And honestly, introducing Gwen Stacy in this movie also was, like, fatal mistake. I think her being in this movie is a disaster, and they were planning to have Mary Jane be an Amazing Spider-Man 2, and I think that would have been a disaster. You know, and I know that in the comics they both characters are there, but I just think in one movie it's very hard to have both characters.
I agree. Yeah, I think yeah, because Gwen is kind of tied in with Eddie Brock in this storyline. So I think if you just took out Eddie Brock, took out Venom, took out Symbiote, took out Gwen, we would have had a lot higher quality of a film. And that's a shame, because it's like it was so close, you know. It's like Rogue One, we were on the verge of greatness. We were this close, you know.
Yeah, and you know, if I were to rank it, I mean, yeah, is it the worst of the trilogy? Yeah, but like by easily. How much? I mean, it's entertaining. I could watch it still.
Right, it's still solidly entertaining movie. And I mean, upon rewatching, I don't know if it's the meme quality or just me laughing and knowing it's bad, but I don't mind Bully Maguire as much as probably most people do. But like it's kind of fun, right? It's like, oh, this has actually happened. You kind of laugh at that.
I will say, like, so the one thing this movie has, and honestly, it's just a factor of time. The VFX in this movie is phenomenal for 2007. Like, I was
Right.
watching this on my 4K disc, and it looks insane. And no matter how much I hate the Venom storyline, having the black Spider-Man suit
Oh my
looks
god,
great.
amazing.
Yeah, so it's like, I don't know, it's one of those situations like with Rise of Skywalker where it's like I'm not in love with the whole movie, but there are certain things I really love about this movie
Right.
that it's like, would I have given them up just to have a better movie? And it's like, I don't know. I mean, maybe in an alternate reality where I'd never seen this one, but there's some things I really, really, really like about this movie, like I did with Rise of Skywalker, where it's like, I don't know if I'd want to replace it.
Right, and I mean, like, it's not like it's completely useless. Like, the black Spider-Man suit and the symbiote does have an effect on the Sandman storyline, because I think the black Spider-Man suit versus Sandman fight's really awesome.
Yeah, and it's also one of the more visually impressive scenes in the movie too, because you're having Sandman like getting absolutely like destroyed, and then him turning into mud, like just some really really cool VFX shots. And you know, Sandman's storyline, I mean, it's really deep. I mean, we're talking about a character that just wrong place, wrong time, wrong thing to do, and
Right.
it's an internal struggle with him because yes, he did pull that trigger and he blames himself, but he also wants to do right by his family. And the fact
Yeah.
that, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man has it in him to forgive him for what he did. I mean, it just speaks as a character as a whole.
Right, yeah. That scene at the end where he tells them the real thing that happened with Uncle Ben, and he's like, I don't need you to forgive me, I just need you to understand me. And then Peter goes as far and he's like, I do forgive you, man. It's a tearjerker. It's just such an emotional scene, and it speaks volume to Peter Parker as a character. And then that whole ending. I mean, even with the Venom stuff included, I think the end fight of this movie is really cool. The way we see like Ultimate Sandman, and then we get a team up. We hadn't really seen team up stuff, X-Men aside, in comic book movies, really. And then we see Goblin and Peter team up and fight him, and then Harry dies, and it's emotional too. And I think this movie ends on a really good emotional note.
Yeah, I think leaving out of Spider-Man 3, I think they could have done a good Spider-Man 4. Like, I think things were in place. I think Spider-Man 4 would have been a very fresh start for the trilogy because, you'd have Peter and MJ, but they're not really together, which honestly would have probably been the good time to introduce Gwen Stacy at this point, but they didn't. Because, like, in a hypothetical Spider-Man 4, I think you would have then introduced Gwen Stacy because MJ doesn't want to be with Peter anymore after the events of Spider-Man 3. And so introducing Gwen would have worked really well. And then you also, now Harry Osborne isn't in the movie. The Osborns aren't there at all. And so I think, yeah, Spider-Man 4 would have been a very fresh look at the franchise.
Yeah, and then speaking too, again, I mean, we probably would have dove deeper with this in Spider-Man 4, but a thing that I love about this series, this trilogy, is we see like an adult Spider-Man. Especially moving on after Spider-Man 2 onward, we get to see Spider-Man as an adult face these real-world problems, whereas, Andrew Garfield was still developing, and then in Tom Holland, he's a kid, and they really abuse that kid high school vibe, setting throughout those movies to their strength as well. But it's very different seeing like a Tom Holland Spider-Man versus a Tobey Maguire Spider-Man.
I think we would have. I mean, the really bad thing about Garfield's run is that we didn't, just like Maguire, they don't have complete runs. I mean, sure, Maguire has a somewhat tied up thing, but there was a planned Spider-Man 4. There was more planned for this character. He got
Right, it was
short.
greenlit, ready to go, and everything.
Right, and Amazing Spider-Man had 2 sequels ready to go, a spin-off, Sinister Six, ready to go, and it's like, so, this is why I like to defend the Andrew Garfield movies, because honestly, this wasn't their fault. I understand that people don't love Amazing Spider-Man 2. I'm probably someone who likes it more than an average because I knew that I liked Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man, and so it's easier for me to be like, okay, I'm going to overlook these things because I really like him as Spider-Man. I'd love to see more. And he got it cut short, and I think Holland's the only one right now who looks like he is just, they're going to be able to, when Holland says he's ready to leave, I think they will allow him to leave, and they'll also give him a send-off. And I think that's the difference between our last two Spider-Mans, that they didn't get send-offs. They just had not Maguire less than Garfield, but they had some open-ended stuff going on.
Yeah, and I mean, fingers crossed, hopefully we get some kind of, closing to their story like that in No Way Home, which I think would be really cool to see, because we didn't get to see that before.
Yeah, I'm hoping that No Way Home has a very definitive ending, because we haven't really gotten that with any of the three or the previous two MCU ones. But again, we're going to...
Right, because they are installments.
Yeah, but again, we're going to be talking next week about Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. We're going to dive way deeper into that. And then the following week, we're going to be talking about Tom Holland's Spider-Man and his introduction to the MCU and all this. And then finally, we're going to, in week 4, we're going to be talking about Spider-Man No Way Home. Me and Daniel booked our tickets last night. That was an absolute mess. I mean, hands down, worst ticket ordering experience I have ever had. And like, Force Awakens was annoying. This was just outright bad. I mean, I sat there for 4 hours trying to get tickets. I know that Daniel was luckily able to get in like 30 minutes, but he also chose a showtime for like a Saturday instead of Thursday night. And so, yeah, just an absolute mess. And it kind of goes to show the popularity of Spider-Man right now.
I mean, yeah. I mean, you look at just the box office numbers alone for this Raimi trilogy. I mean, people love them some Spider-Man.
Yeah, I mean, you had $821 million for Spider-Man 1. You then had, $788 million for Spider-Man 2, so just, a little bit of a decrease. And you had Spider-Man 3 that just, for the fact that a lot of people don't like this movie, it made almost $900 million. It's like, it goes to show the power of Spider-Man. I think if we had seen, instead of Amazing Spider-Man, we'd seen Spider-Man 4.
Oh, man.
I want to say we might have seen Spider-Man cross the $1 billion mark at that point.
I think
but instead, it took until Far From Home to finally get Spider-Man to cross that $1 billion mark.
Right, yeah. But wrapping up, this impact of the trilogy as a whole, it's one of the staple comic book trilogies, one of the better ones because of how good Spider-Man 1 and 2 are. Spider-Man 3, it's not a dumpster fire like everybody says. It's not great. It's not at that level, but it's still a solidly entertaining movie. And this really kicked off the era of comic book movies, introduced us to one of the best portrayals of the character, of all these characters, honestly. I think everybody's portrayal of their respective characters is awesome and, financially really successful and just kind of set the standard for what these movies have become.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. And, they're definitely worth a rewatch if you haven't seen them anytime soon.
Yep, totally. Toby Maguire is forever my Spider-Man. Hope to see him in No Way Home. But that's going to do it for us here for the Raimi trilogy. We'll be back with Amazing Spider-Man double feature next time. See you guys then.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Timebreaker Podcast.
If you did enjoy, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe and make sure to ring that notification bell for new episodes every Wednesday.
See you next week.